Welcome to Refuting Rationality, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist Rationality Rules. In today's episode, Mr. Rationality is going to try and prove evolution with a top 10 list, -1. Let's begin.
People very often confuse abiogenesis with evolution, when they shouldn't. Abiogenesis is the study of how life first emerged from non-living matter, and it's not discussed within this video. Evolution, on the other hand, is the study of biological change over time, and it is the star of this video. Now, with that said and out of the way, let's get on with the video.
People do not confuse abiogenesis with evolution. Unless you are a theistic evolutionist, then abiogenesis poses a significant problem for evolutionism. So when evolution is discussed, abiogenesis naturally gets discussed as well. The evolutionist would like to separate the two because they don't have an answer for abiogenesis, or at least not a rational one.
So, where to begin? Well, the first two lines of evidence that I'm going to present both come from the comparative anatomy of whales to land mammals. We've long known that despite whales looking like fish, they're mammals, because just like mammals and unlike fish, they give birth to live young, feed their young milk via their mammary glands, breathe through two lungs rather than gills, have skin and hair rather than skin and scales, and they're warm-blooded. Now this alone strongly implies that they share a common ancestor with land mammals. But what really makes this suggestion even more compelling, and what I'll offer as a first line of evidence, is the curious bone structure of their flippers. Within their flippers, whales have, just like the forelimbs of land mammals, finger, hand, wrist and arm bones, which can be easily explained if these bones are repurposed forelimbs, but are remarkably hard to explain if they're not. As after all, these bones have very little in common with non-mammalian fins, and yet a great deal in common with the forelimbs of land mammals.
And you see how he skipped a step there. He showed the bone structure being similar to human bones, and he claims they have resemblance to most mammals, but he doesn't actually go to the trouble of drawing a line to show how these bone structures could actually be evolutionarily connected. For instance, later in the video, he will say that the hippopotamus is the most closely related relative of the whale. So, does the hippopotamus have these bone structures? I don't think so. He certainly doesn't mention it. All he's done is made an unsubstantiated assertion that because whales have similar fin bones to other mammal limb bones, that they would somehow be related. However, a common designer explains similarity in bone structures just as well as common descent, and it even explains it better if you can't even map out a line of the common descent. That is to say, the bone structure was passed on from this creature to this creature to this creature to this creature. Who had the structure first? Humans or bats? Whales or humans? This is a poor argument from a similarity.
Furthermore, and to invoke a second line of evidence, whales have strange bones that look like shriveled hip, thigh and shin bones where land mammals have hind legs. And some of these bones, such as these from a bonehead whale, even have what appears to be a ball and socket joint. Further still, paleontologists have found numerous species within the fossil record that have unique similarities with whales, but also varying sizes of hind legs. Now once again, these bones make perfect sense if they're vestigial and or repurposed, but they're very peculiar if they're not.
Those bones are used for mating. They are not vestigial. This is another weak argument from similarity, which can be explained much better with a common designer. If your proof of evolution can be countered with, I would expect that in my worldview too, then it's not proof. It's not even great evidence.
Talking of vestigial traits, and to present a third line of evidence, a superb example can be found in all mammals, including you, and it's called the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Without getting too technical, this nerve runs from the brain to the voice box, which should be a distance of a few inches. But instead it goes down into the chest, loops around a main artery, and then goes back up to the voice box, which in the case of the giraffe results in a 15-foot detour. a mistake that no engineer would ever make. However, in animals without a neck, such as fish, the most direct route for this nerve is indeed by navigating round the artery, and hence, if mammals evolved from fish-like ancestors, we can easily explain why this absurd design exists. But if, on the other hand, we want to insist that it was deliberately created this way by a designer, then, well, we certainly can't call this designer intelligent.
By that logic, we couldn't call humans intelligent either, because we put car engines in the front of cars and have to pipe the exhaust all the way to the back, rather than just putting the engine in the back or putting the exhaust up front. Designs have reasons, and in this case, that nerve does not just go to the voice box. It connects to everything on the way to the voice box. And as for his assumption that it's that way because it makes sense for fish to have the nerve that way, I'm going to quote something from a Creation.com article to hammer down this point. And I quote, "Even apart from this function, there are features that are the result of embryonic development, not because of evolution, but because the embryo develops from a single cell in a certain order. For example, the embryo needs a functioning, simple heart early on. This later descends to its position in the chest, dragging the nerve bundle with it." End quote. As Mr. Rationality has never designed and created a human before, he doesn't really have the experience necessary to judge what is and is not good design.
Fourth and fifth lines of evidence that I'm going to present both come from DNA sequencing, which, for those of you unaware, is the process of determining the precise order of nucleotides within a DNA molecule, which put simply means that we can compare the DNA of one organism to another, and in doing so, see exactly how closely related they are. Needless to say, by doing this we have made many outstanding discoveries. But perhaps the most extraordinary, and what I offer as a fourth line of evidence, is that all living things are related, and that therefore all living things share a common ancestor. Seriously, of the DNA that is comparable, you share 97% with a chimpanzee, 80% with a cow, 60% with a fruit fly, and 50% with a banana. Now, most of us have heard this fact before and treated it like it's just a bit of trivia, including myself, but it's far more than this. It's unimpeachable proof that all living things share a common ancestor, and considering that all living things don't look the same, it's overwhelming evidence for evolution.
Overwhelming, he says. Impeachable, he says. It is both underwhelming and very impeachable. First of all, similarities in DNA do not prove relation. Any two kinds of animals with two eyes will have at least however much percentage of DNA similarity it takes to have two eyes. Any physical similarity you see between two animals will also mean that they share at least some percentage in common in DNA. If we had 0% in common DNA with a banana, bananas would be toxic. We would not be able to eat them. Having similar DNA is just good design. And again, if the facts can be explained by my worldview just as easily as yours, then you haven't proven anything. In fact, if evolution were true, then odds are there should be at least one creature out there, whether plant or animal, that shares 0% DNA with something. To make this more clear, he is committing the fallacy of confirming the consequent. If evolution, then similar DNA. Similar DNA, therefore evolution. This syllogism is invalid for the same reason that if it's raining, the grass will be red. The grass is red, therefore it's raining, is also invalid.
And the second line of evidence from DNA that I'll present, and the fifth within this video, is that the closest living relative to cetaceans, which is a class that includes whales, is the hippopotamus, a land mammal that just so happens to share many very rare commonalities with cetaceans. For example, both mammals are nearly hairless, do not have sweat glands, have remarkably thick bones, are encased in dense fat, have multi-chambered stomachs, give birth to their young underwater, feed their young underwater, and communicate with their kin underwater. Now, all of these similarities once again make perfect sense if cetaceans and hippos share a common ancestor, as their DNA screams, let alone suggests. But if they didn't evolve from a common ancestor, then all of these similarities are one hell of a coincidence, and DNA is the greatest troll in history.
There's nothing coincidental about a common designer. And of course, since the idea that DNA proves relation is the fallacy of confirming the consequent, saying that whales are closely related to hippopotamus is begging the question. And all of those similarities he listed, or at least the vast majority of them, can easily be explained by how much time the hippopotamus spends in water. Of course it's nearly hairless. Hair is not good for underwater, generally speaking. Wet fur is heavier than no fur, and hippopotamuses are heavy enough as it is. And as much time as they spend in water, they do not need sweat glands. Thick bones. Of course they have thick bones. They're big, encased in dense fat. Water is cold. Insulation is good. Give birth to the young underwater and feed their young underwater are both givens, given how much hippopotamus spend in the water. And that goes with communication as well. And I'll finish this clip by pointing out the reification fallacy he just made. DNA does not suggest, let alone scream, anything. The only information DNA can communicate is the information it contains. And the only information it contains is the building blocks to whatever creature it comes from.
The sixth line of evidence that I'll present is the artificial selection of domestic dogs.
Oh wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
It's no secret that most breeds of dog have the specific traits that they do because humans have deliberately or artificially selected which dogs get to reproduce, and in doing so, which traits are passed on to subsequent generations. For example, greyhounds have powerful legs, deep chests, flexible spines, and slim builds because humans have deliberately bred dogs with these attributes. The same is true of the tiny height of chihuahuas. They are the result of humans breeding smaller and smaller dogs. And the same is also true of the giant height of Great Danes. They are the result of humans breeding bigger and bigger dogs. It may not seem like it, but domestic dog breeds alone not only suggest evolution, they demonstrate it.
Everybody with me now. They're still dogs. No amount of selective breeding will ever produce a different kind. If you want to demonstrate evolution, turn a fruit fly into a dragonfly, or perhaps breed an amoeba with a skeleton. They go through enough generations fast enough. If evolution were true, you should be able to do it.
Now, as we've just explained, the selective pressure in the case of domestic dog breeds is artificial. It's humans deliberately selecting which dogs get to reproduce. But this raises the immediate question of what exactly selects which organisms get to reproduce in nature. And the answer is nature. To further explain this, and to give you a few fascinating examples, I'm going to have Thomas from Holy Kool-Aid jump in. Enjoy.
This first example is a bit of a celebrity in the world of evolutionary biology, the peppered moth. During the Industrial Revolution, coal plants dumped out enough air pollution to kill the light-colored algae on trees and coat the foliage with soot. The light gray moths, which once blended in against the bark of the trees, were now exposed and were picked off by birds and other predators. But a small percent of the population had a rare genetic mutation that led to dark-colored wings. This beneficial mutation gave them a survival advantage, allowing them to camouflage in with their changing environment. Before long, the majority of the peppered moth population were the darker variety. But in the 1950s, clean energy reform reversed this trend, causing the dark moths to be more vulnerable, leading to a resurgence in the lighter-colored moths, who were still the dominant variety in the less polluted countryside. Now that genome sequencing has become available and affordable for scientists, researchers at the University of Liverpool have pinpointed the exact mutation that caused the color change.
And again, it is still a moth. Not only that, but it didn't even change breeds of moth. This is not a proof for evolution. It's not even good evidence for evolution.
Another excellent example of evolution in action is the silent crickets of Hawaii. To attract a mate, male crickets on the island of Kauai would rub their wings together to create a chirping noise. Several years ago, a parasitic fly entered their ecosystem, honing in on the noisy crickets and laying larvae inside of them that would eat them from the inside out. A rare mutation on the X chromosome caused some crickets to develop without the ridges on their wings required to chirp. Natural selection did its thing, and within just 20 generations, 95% of the crickets on the island were silent. When the flies migrated to Oahu a few years later, the crickets there independently underwent the same life-saving evolutionary change via a different mutation.
Again, still a cricket, still the same breed of cricket.
Now that's all fine and dandy, creationists might argue, but those are all examples of microevolution, not macroevolution. Animals never change species or reproduce outside their kind. Which brings us to ring species. For this, we'll take a look at the greenish warbler of the Himalayas, which biologists believe migrated south to north, branching east and west around the mountains. As time passed, they evolved and adapted to their new environments, but by the time they met up north of the Himalayas, they were so different that they were no longer able to interbreed. Each bird reproduced with its southern neighbors all the way back around the loop, but they couldn't reproduce with each other. A textbook example of evolution in progress, if I've ever seen one.
Well, you've never seen one, and those birds are all still birds. These last three proofs, as you call them, seem predicated on a straw man of what creationists believe about natural selection, especially this last one. Speciation is not a problem. Speciation happens, and I would not call speciation macroevolution. But, to be fair, I don't use the term evolution anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But if it did, macroevolution would be changing from one kind of animal to another kind of animal, such as changing from a lizard to a mammal. Before I go, I want to attack the fundamental ideology of evolution, and I'll even do it with a syllogism. If evolution were true, then our senses would not be reliable. Our senses are reliable. Therefore, evolution is not true.